As we've already ranked the bosses of Limgrave and Liurnia, now in the Altus Plateau we do battle with a number of bosses that are retreads, combinations, or straight up facsimiles of previous encounters. So if you say Ghost, you didn't talk about so-and-so, it's because we discussed said boss in either one of those videos linked below in the description. With so many repeats, this video will not only include the Altus Plateau, but also encompass Volcano Manor, Mount Gelmir, and Leyndell, the capital, minus the endgame bosses. Also, I'm going to stream here on YouTube sometime this weekend, so look out for that. In the meantime, enjoy this video. Kindreds of Rot. It's most likely you've already had a horrific run-in with these demonic bug assassins, as you can be transported via a trapped chest fairly early in the game. I don't know if these guys were going for the grossly incandescent look and ended up as nasty pale white bugs or what, but add in the way they slither around and snipe you with their ranged needles of death, and my only thought was to get these guys out of there as quickly as possible. Usually I like to feel out a boss, see their range of attacks and movements, take in the arena and soundtrack, but not this time. A boss that will probably not live long amongst the pantheon of legendary encounters. Wormface. This creepy monstrosity escaped Old Yharnam and tripled in size. His sheer height makes combat a bit awkward, as getting into melee range to hack away at his skinny legs means you can't actually see what he's doing. Getting this guy to topple from posture damage isn't nearly as satisfying either, as taking down the gargantuan ironclad guardian golems has much more weight and gravity to it. It's an interesting callback to Bloodborne, but the shape of the character model limits the fight quite a bit. Demi-Human Queens Margit, Maggie, and Gillica. I'm gonna just lump these three Vicar Amelia knockoffs into one entry, as they're essentially the same boss 3 times. Maybe the idea was that if the developers included the same boss 3 times in a vast open world, you'd run into one of the 3. Interestingly, Margit, who again looks suspiciously similar to Vicar Amelia, drops the Jar Cannon, also known as the Cannon in Bloodborne, in pretty close proximity to Elden Ring's Bloodborne DLC, also known as Volcano Manor. Not sure what to make of any of that right now, but it definitely made me go, huh. The actual combat is to essentially roll dodge into her crotch and wail away. I'm currently sitting around 120 hours of playtime and love most of what Elden Ring has to offer, but my one critique of the game would be that a number of the mini-bosses don't have that much to offer. It's hard to feel as though some weren't included to simply round out certain areas. Fell Twins. The way in which the player encounters this boss is certainly one of the more unique in the game, as you wander into the abyss in an arena or lack thereof, reminiscent of the 4 Kings in Dark Souls. Although the entry is cool, we've already faced these bosses throughout the Altus Plateau and capital in multiple forms, so it's not the most exciting encounter. It's pretty common to have a boss appear later in games as a common enemy, but it's an odd decision to have a common enemy you've already faced be a boss, even with the unique environment. Also strange, they only attacked me one at a time. Perhaps it was my positioning, and on other occasions both may aggro at the same time, but this sort of defeated the point of a multi-opponent boss to me. A fun scenario, but not the bossiest boss in the world. Falling Star Beast and full-grown Falling Star Beast. It's tough deciding what to make of these guys. The concept of an asteroidal beast that crashed into the lands between from space is a creative implied backstory for a boss, and the design aesthetically looks pretty cool, but on the contrary, the combat isn't always satisfying. For example, as they are made from asteroid and space rock material, they obviously aren't going to make a typical squishy sound on taking damage. As per their construction, a more muted clinking sound plays out, which doesn't have any weight to it, and it can even be hard to tell if you registered contact at all. Maybe I just have shitty hearing, but that was my observation. It is fun dueling these guys atop Torrent, a fun encounter albeit not the cleanest combat. Necromancer Garrus. My critique with many of the casting-based bosses previously in Elden Ring is that they cast, but then they just wait around for you to do something, which creates no tension or urgency in the fight. I'm not going to pretend like this is one of the best bosses in the game, but on a design level, the combination of Necromancer Garrus casting followed up by melee pressure works much better. This is also a rare example where the additional enemies in the room make sense with the character and don't feel like they were included just for the sake of artificially increasing the difficulty of the encounter. Not the most aesthetically interesting character, as I barely remembered what he looked like without rewatching the footage. A solidly designed fight that lacks the memorability factor. Sanguine Noble. While not the craziest boss in the world, Elden Ring is crying out for more encounters like this. Just something different and new to play with. In fairness, a version of him does exist in Rose Church, so he's not completely unique, and his design and moveset isn't anything out of the ordinary or too crazy, but he's a breath of fresh air after fighting so many burial watchdogs, black knife assassins, ulcerated tree spirits, and any of the other bosses repeated so frequently. They don't have to be anything out of the ordinary, but why not take the idea of the blood-based Sanguine Noble, even something as simple as fat rolling when caught in his blood pools, and have a boss that is madness heavy or frost damage heavy, at least in terms of unique mini-bosses. It just feels like a boss that could have been expanded upon in terms of all the status effects that are in the game. Godskin Apostle. I was originally going to call this guy a pretty average boss, but upon the rewatch and encounters with him elsewhere in the game, he's actually a very well-rounded boss. He has a fantastic soundtrack, which he shares with the Godskin Noble. His Godskin Peeler, which doubles as a rapier on one end and scythe on the other, is pretty sweet, and even casts some dark magic spells. As I've mentioned before, bosses that create action in melee range and distance are usually more exciting than bosses who just do one or the other. It's not a hard set rule, but it seems to be the case in many Elden Ring bosses. According to the Godskin Apostle Robe, the Apostles once said to serve Destin's death are wielders of the god-slaying Black Flame. But after their defeat by Malekith the Black Blade, the source of their power was sealed away. Abductor Virgins. This is a boss I would have probably never found without the internet. First, you have to take a leap of faith at the bottom of the Raya Academy Lucaria at the bottom of the massive lift. Then you have to die specifically to the Iron Maiden's grab attack in order to be transported to Volcano Manor. These are one of the more creative enemies in Elden Ring, as they really evoke memories of the Prison of Hope in Demon Souls for me. I just love the design of these contraptions, especially with their differing weapon attachments like something out of BattleBots. Fighting them can be pretty awkward, but they still look cool as shit and are cleverly designed, something I would have sketched for fun as a kid. Enemies like this are where From Software's creativity really shines through. Godskin Noble. This guy caps off an area which I can only refer to as Bloodborne 2. So great news everyone, the long-awaited sequel is now under development. They included the first level as a sneak peek in Elden Ring. The Godskin Noble attire says nobles are the most ancient apostles who are said to have assimilated inhuman physiology, not unlike the Crucible, the Erdtree in its primordial form. Maybe it's his silly ballooning rolling attack or his massive leap and smash attack, but this guy reminds me of a boss in a Mario game, minus the rapier I suppose. His sheer size makes the combat a bit funky, but he's quite a fun boss to try to get in and out on, and his rapid fire rapier known as the Godskin Stitcher makes for a nice mix-up along with a few dark flame attacks. Not to mention, he has a spectacular soundtrack as mentioned in the Godskin Apostle entry. While a seemingly important character at first due to his location, his item drops actually don't reveal as much backstory as you would think, except referring to his nobility. Another unique encounter after an area very reminiscent of Bloodborne. Not part of the rankings, but I did want to give an honorable mention here to Ancient Dragon Lanciex, as he's basically an evolution of a dragon fight we've had multiple times up to this point, but look how cool he looks. Also, shout out to the double Crucible Night fight. Go check out Ongball's channel if you want to see an inhuman player take them on. Mohg the Omen. For the honesty of this list and video, I have to say I did fight the underground version with Phase 2 in all of his glory first, so even though this was technically a repeat for me, he's important enough that I didn't want to leave him off this list. In continuing the honesty, this boss just isn't for me, but I know a lot of you loved your 2 encounters with him, so I'm trying to place him in an unbiased spot in the rankings. I'll admit, his design aesthetically looks really cool, with his long blue robes with gold and red trim, monstrosity of a head, and massive trident staff. I'm going to keep this entry brief though, and we'll go deeper in the underground rankings with this full Phase 2. Hopefully the fight grows on me by then. Morgott the Omen King. Essentially an evolved form of Margit. As I understand, Morgott actually is the true form of Margit, with his great rune being the anchor ring that houses the base and proves 2 things. That the Omen King was born of the golden lineage, and that he was indeed the Lord of Leyndell. As his remembrance continues, though born one of the graceless Omen, Morgott took it upon himself to become the Erdtree's protector. He loved not in return, for he was never loved, but nevertheless, love it he did. While he is similar in combat to Margit, he wields a much wider variety of attack patterns to dodge or avoid, as he can roll catch at a number of different intervals. As well, he can also now cast a magic spear in addition to his dagger and great hammer. He can even summon raining spikes, as well as a tricky phase 2 where he goes completely nuts and has what appears to be an arcane buff on certain attacks. All this takes place in front of the great Erdtree in a solid contest. Godefroy, first Elden Lord. I could be wrong, so please don't spoil it below, but I would be shocked if this is the last version of Godefroy I see before completing Elden Ring. When I walked through the boss fog, my first instinct was, Godefroy, what the fuck are you doing here? I thought you were like the boss of the game. In all seriousness, this ghostly version of Godefroy is obviously a prelude to what I'm assuming would be a late game encounter, so I'll fill in the lore when that time comes. As far as the combat, he utilizes his massive axe to perform a huge range of attacks that strike in different intervals, harshly punishing roll spam, forcing the player to dodge at the correct time. Never mind a stomp attack, as well as some jumps and dives. In addition to the excellent combat, his ghostly golden aesthetic looks phenomenal, the arena is unique in comparison with many others, and the soundtrack is one of the best in the game. I can't wait to fight what I'm sure is his human form down the home stretch. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. From what I've heard, this boss has a bit of a split opinion amongst the community, but I certainly fall into the camp of being blown away by this evolution of the classic Storm Ruler fight, which began in Demon Souls with the Storm King, progressed into a contest with Yorm the Giant, and found a new form here in the Serpent Hunter. If you're playing blind after defeating the God-devouring serpent, you probably had the classic feeling of, well, that definitely seemed way too easy for this occasion. Before moving directly into the surprise, or not so much of Phase 2, I should say Phase 1 isn't to be sneezed at, as it sets the table nicely for the player to gain a grasp on the mechanics of the Serpent Hunter, which contains a few different moves with slow and fast windups that accordingly deal more or less damage, even a fully powered Ash of War attack built into the weapon, as opposed to the Storm Ruler, which really only had one attack against Storm King or Yorm respectively. Offhand, the Demon Souls Storm Ruler may have its own R1, but is not as differentiated as this occasion. Technicalities aside, the smoothness with which you can wield this weapon on this giant beast, which reminds me of a Metroid boss personally, feels fantastic. In the dramatic Phase 2, as Rykard reveals himself, the battle continues in tense, dramatic fashion with the pressure and attack variety ramped up. If I had one small critique, it would be that Rykard's Red Skull shower attack doesn't seem to have a counter except for to just run the hell away and get out of there. But that could just be my lack of knowledge in how to deal with it. As stated in his rune, Rykard was amongst the children of Rennala and Radagon, who became demigod stepchildren after Radagon's union with Queen Marika. But Rykard fed himself to the blasphemous serpent, great rune and all, as well as his remembrance continuing. Rykard took the form of a giant serpent that he might devour, grow, and live eternally. I understand the road of blasphemy is long and perilous. One cannot walk it unprepared to sin. A phenomenally designed and conceived boss, and the best of the Altus Plateau for me. I'm gonna stream some Elden Ring sometime here this weekend on YouTube, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you for watching the video. Have a good one. Peace.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.